The airport buzzed with life. Families dragging heavy suitcases, business travelers glued to their phones, kids darting ahead of tired parents. It was the usual chaos. Colonel Eric Lawson stepped inside, his polished black dress shoes clicking against the tile floor. He had walked through airports countless times before, but today was different. The weight pressing on his chest wasn't just from the ribbons and medals adorning his uniform. It was from the casket waiting on the tarmac, draped in the American flag. Private First Class Nathaniel Brooks, 21 years old. Gone too soon. Colonel Lawson adjusted his hat and took a slow, steady breath. He had a job to do, a duty that went beyond rank or recognition. It wasn't about him. It was about keeping a sacred promise, one that every soldier made to their brothers and sisters in arms. No one gets left behind. He approached the airline counter, setting down his military orders and identification. The woman behind the desk barely looked up at first, typing something into the computer before suddenly pausing. A hesitation, just a split second too long. Sir, can I see that again?" Her voice was tight. Lawson handed over the documents once more, his sharp eyes catching the flicker of uncertainty in hers. She glanced sideways at her coworker, shifting slightly as if she had just realized she had stepped into something she wasn't prepared for. Then, she turned and whispered something to another agent. The man she spoke to barely reacted, only stealing a quick glance in Lawson's direction. The moment stretched, thick with something unspoken. Lawson had seen this before, though he never got used to it. When the woman finally returned, her smile was stiff and forced. "I'm sorry, sir, but there seems to be an issue with your ticket," she said carefully. "We can't allow you to board at this time." Lawson exhaled slowly. He had handled combat zones, foreign diplomacy, and political entanglements. But this was different. "I'm escorting the remains of a fallen soldier," he said evenly, tapping the paperwork in front of her. "Everything is in order." The agent didn't meet his eyes. "I understand, sir, but there's a security protocol in place. We can't override it." Lawson kept his voice calm, steady. "Security protocol?" "Yes, sir." She forced another weak smile. "It's just policy." Policy. Behind him, the line of passengers was growing. People shifted, murmuring. He felt their eyes on him, but instead of stepping aside, he squared his shoulders. He wasn't leaving without an answer. The airline staff wasn't backing down either. The air around the counter felt heavier now. Conversations behind him were quieting as people took notice. A man in full military uniform being denied a flight wasn't something you saw every day. Colonel Lawson remained composed. "Ma'am, I need to understand exactly what the issue is. This is a military assignment, not a personal trip. My documentation is valid." The agent hesitated, her eyes darting toward the back, where a small cluster of airline employees whispered among themselves. Finally, a supervisor, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a weary expression, stepped forward. He adjusted his name tag and folded his arms. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience," he began, his voice carrying that professional detachment people used when they wanted you to stop asking questions. "But we have certain policies in place, and unfortunately, we can't override them at this time." That phrase again. Policies. Lawson inhaled slowly through his nose. He had heard this before. "I've flown military escorts before," he said, keeping his frustration buried under years of discipline. "I know the procedure, and I know there's no policy stopping me from boarding. So let's be honest. What's the real reason I'm being denied?" The supervisor cleared his throat, shifting on his feet. "It's just an extra security measure. Nothing personal, sir." Nothing personal. That was rich. Lawson tightened his jaw, but kept his composure. He had been in too many rooms where people hid behind vague explanations, waiting for him to react, to lose his temper, to give them a reason to call security. He wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. The passengers in line were watching now. A woman in a red blazer whispered something to her husband. A young man holding his boarding pass frowned, glancing between the airline employees like he was trying to make sense of what was happening. Then, a voice cut through the tension. "Sir, do you have an issue with his military clearance?" Lawson turned his head slightly. A man a few spots behind him had spoken up, older, maybe in his 60s, with a weathered face and a U.S. Army veteran cap pulled low over his brow. A soldier, a veteran. The supervisor looked uncomfortable. "No, sir, This isn't about clearance, we just have to follow standard protocol. The veteran let out a sharp breath. Yeah, I've been through security 1,000 times, and I've never seen a protocol stop a soldier from escorting one of our own home. He folded his arms. So what is it, really? Murmurs spread through the line. People started pulling out their phones. Recording. The air in the terminal had changed. The staff behind the counter could feel it too. The agent who had initially denied Lawson's flight stole a glance at her supervisor, looking unsure now. The supervisor sighed, rubbing a hand over his temple. He looked at Lawson again, the weight of the moment settling in. "Let me check something," he muttered before walking off. The agent at the counter kept her gaze down, suddenly very interested in her computer screen. Lawson didn't move. He stood tall, shoulders squared, staring straight ahead. He wasn't going anywhere. But neither was this story. The supervisor shifted uncomfortably. "No, sir, this isn't about clearance. We just have to follow standard protocol." The veteran in the army cap let out a sharp breath, his patience wearing thin. "Yeah?" he challenged. "I've been through security 1,000 times, and I've never seen protocols stop a soldier from escorting one of our own home." He folded his arms. "So what is it, really?" The murmurs in the terminal grew louder. Passengers glanced at each other, brows furrowed in confusion and concern. Then, as if a silent signal had been given, people started pulling out their phones, recording. The shift in the air was undeniable. The staff behind the counter could feel it too. The agent who had initially denied Colonel Eric Lawson's boarding stole a nervous glance at her supervisor, suddenly unsure of the decision she had just enforced. The supervisor sighed, rubbing his temple before looking back at Lawson. The weight of the moment was pressing down on him now. "Let me check something," he muttered before turning and walking away. The agent at the counter dropped her gaze, pretending to focus on the computer screen in front of her. But everyone could see the way her fingers hovered stiffly over the keyboard, motionless. Lawson didn't move. He stood tall, shoulders squared, his face unreadable. He wasn't going anywhere. But neither was this story. The murmuring in the terminal wasn't just idle background noise anymore. It had focus, energy. Passengers were no longer just waiting for their flights. They were watching. Recording. The veteran who had spoken up wasn't the only one growing irritated. A middle-aged woman in a navy blue jacket clutched her purse tightly, shaking her head as she leaned toward her husband. "This isn't right," she whispered. A young man in a black hoodie pulled out his phone, fingers moving fast as he typed. People were paying attention now, and that was dangerous for the airline. Lawson kept his expression neutral, but inside he was making note of every detail. The supervisor still hadn't returned. That meant one of two things. He was either scrambling for an excuse or waiting for this to die down. Neither was going to happen. Then from behind a voice spoke up. "Excuse me, sir?" Lawson turned his head slightly. A young woman, no older than 25, stood a few feet away. She held her phone tightly in one hand, her expression uncertain but determined. I don't mean to intrude," she said hesitantly. "But I just want to make sure I understand. They're not letting you board?" Her voice wasn't loud, but the careful way she said it, deliberate, questioning, made the people nearby focus even more. Lawson exhaled, then glanced at the agent behind the counter. "That's correct." The young woman blinked, as if she expected to hear something different. She hesitated for just a second, then nodded and turned her phone screen toward him. "I'm live right now," she said. "People need to see this." And just like that, the floodgates opened. A man a few feet away raised his phone. "This is wrong," he muttered, shaking his head. "This man is literally escorting a fallen soldier." Further back, a woman's voice rose above the hum of the crowd. "Hey, excuse me?" She waved her hand toward the counter. "Can someone explain why he's being denied?" A ripple of discomfort moved through the line. Some passengers hesitated, unsure whether to get involved. Others shifted uncomfortably, but their focus never wavered. The energy had changed. What had started as scattered whispers was turning into something bigger, something the airline staff could no longer ignore. The agent behind the counter looked like she wanted to disappear. Her fingers hovered stiffly over the keyboard, her eyes flickering toward the camera lenses now pointed in her direction. Then the veteran in the army cap took a step forward. He was done playing nice. "I've seen a lot in my time," he said, his voice steady but firm. "But I never thought I'd see the day when an American soldier, especially one escorting the remains of a fallen brother, was treated like this." The terminal went eerily quiet. Even the usual airport announcements over the loudspeakers seemed distant, muted. The only sounds were the faint beeps of phones recording, capturing every second of the moment as it unfolded. The veteran squared his shoulders. "This," he said, his voice low but unmistakably strong, "is a disgrace." The agent at the counter swallowed hard. Her hands trembled slightly as she clicked at the keyboard again. The supervisor was still nowhere to be seen. Passengers whispered among themselves. A baby fussed in a stroller, but instead of soothing the child, the mother was staring at her phone, her face tightening as she read something. Then, somewhere in the back of the line, a man muttered under his breath, "It's already trending." Lawson didn't move. He didn't need to. The world was watching now. The tension in the terminal was thick, suffocating. The airline staff stood frozen, locked in an awkward silence. Phones were out, recording, tweeting, streaming, and then, like a spark hitting dry grass, it spread. The young man in the black hoodie let out a low whistle, still glued to his phone. "Damn," he murmured. "This is everywhere now." Lawson didn't react. He knew better than to celebrate too soon, but from the way the agent at the counter stiffened, he could tell she knew it too. The woman in the navy blue jacket checked her phone and gasped. "Oh my God." She whispered to her husband. "It's already on Facebook." The veteran grunted, pulling out his own phone. They don't even know what kind of storm they just started. They didn't even know what kind of storm they had just started. As if on cue, the airport's loudspeaker crackled to life. "Attention passengers, due to unforeseen circumstances, Flight 98 to Denver will be delayed. We apologize for any inconvenience." A few groans rippled through the terminal, but most people weren't even paying attention. Their focus was locked on Colonel Eric Lawson, the uniformed officer being denied his flight while carrying out his solemn duty. A minute later, near the terminal windows, a young woman let out a sharp gasp. "He's on Twitter," she whispered. She turned her phone toward the growing crowd, and people leaned in. On her screen was a bold, all-caps tweet. "They just denied a black U.S. Army colonel his flight while escorting a fallen soldier's remains. This is how we treat our heroes. #let him fly." Below it, the numbers were climbing. Retweets, comments, likes. It was catching fire. Then another post popped up. This one was from a veteran advocacy group. "We are aware of the disgraceful incident happening at Westbrook International Airport. Our soldiers deserve better. Expect action." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. The realization sank in. The airline had officially lost control of the narrative. The agent behind the counter, still frozen in place, let out a shaky breath. Then, without a word, she turned and hurried toward the back, disappearing behind a frosted glass door. She wasn't coming back with an answer. She was coming back with damage control. Lawson adjusted his hat. He had been in situations like this before. Not at an airport, not like this, but in rooms where powerful people suddenly realized they had made the wrong enemy. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't gloating. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't about him. It was about Private First Class Nathaniel Brooks, the young man waiting to go home. And right now, that mission was still incomplete. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were waiting. The atmosphere in the terminal felt different now, charged, expectant. Then, the supervisor finally returned. But he wasn't alone. Beside him walked another man, this one in a sleek navy blue suit. His airline ID was clipped neatly to his pocket, and his steps were brisk, controlled, like someone used to putting out fires. He stopped just short of the counter, scanning the scene. His eyes darted between Lawson, the Army veteran, and the rows of phones still recording. Then, he cleared his throat. "Colonel, I sincerely apologize for the miscommunication," he began smoothly. "It seems there was an error in our system, but we're working to get you on your flight as soon as possible." Miscommunication. Lawson had been in the military long enough to know what that word really meant. It meant we got caught. It meant fix this before it costs us too much. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he let the moment hang, watching as the airline representative shifted under the weight of the silence. Finally, Lawson spoke, his voice measured. "An error, you said?" The man nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. A regrettable mistake. We assure you it was not intentional. A few people in the crowd scoffed. The Army veteran shook his head. The airline rep adjusted his tie, clearly uncomfortable. We'd like to personally escort you to the gate now, Colonel. First-class accommodations, of course. First class, as if that was the point. Lawson glanced past him, toward the counter. The same agent who had denied him his flight was still standing there, staring at the floor, avoiding his gaze. The same agent who had never bothered to check before saying no. Lawson exhaled slowly. I appreciate the urgency, he said, but I need to clarify something. The rep nodded again, too eagerly. Of course. Lawson's voice remained steady. If no one had recorded this, if no one had spoken up, would I still be standing here? A beat of silence. The rep swallowed. Sir, You don't need to answer, Lawson interrupted. He already knew. Everyone in the terminal knew. Another moment of silence. Then a woman in the crowd murmured, He's right. The rep tried again to smooth over the tension. Sir, we sincerely apologize. We both know this isn't about an apology, Lawson said. It's about accountability. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. People weren't just angry anymore. They were disappointed. The rep knew he was losing control. He straightened his posture, trying to regain authority. Colonel, let's get you on your flight now. But before Lawson could respond, a new voice cut in. Sir? A younger man in an airport security uniform had appeared beside the counter. He held out a phone toward the airline rep, his expression tight. I think you should see this. The rep frowned and took the phone. As he scrolled, his face paled. The Army veteran crossed his arms. Something wrong? The rep didn't answer, but Lawson already knew. The backlash had officially exploded beyond the airport. A major news outlet had picked up the story. The headline was blunt. U.S. Army colonel denied flight while escorting fallen soldier. Airline scrambles for answers. Below it, a video clip played. Footage from the terminal. The rep inhaled sharply and handed the phone back. The damage was done. Lawson. The airline rep's voice was thinner now, forced. Colonel Lawson, we deeply regret this situation, he said, his words carefully chosen. We'd like to issue a public statement clarifying. Lawson cut him off. The public already knows the truth. Silence. The rep pressed his lips together. He glanced at the crowd, at the phones still recording, at the people waiting, watching. Lawson met his gaze, unwavering. I don't need first class, he said. I don't need special treatment. His voice didn't rise, but the weight of it carried. I need respect, and so does the soldier I'm escorting. A murmur ran through the crowd. The rep gave a stiff nod, as if that was all he could do now. Understood, sir. Beside Lawson, the Army veteran let out a quiet, approving grunt. Lawson adjusted his hat. Now let me finish this mission. But for the airline, the consequences were only beginning. They had lost control of the situation. The story had spread faster than they could contain it. The terminal no longer felt like an airport. It felt like a press conference. Phones were still up. Passengers were still watching. Then something unexpected happened. A man in a dark blue suit, his posture sharp with authority, walked into the scene. He wasn't from the airline. He wasn't airport security. He was military. The energy in the room shifted. People instinctively moved aside as he approached. His ID badge flashed briefly as he stepped up to Lawson and extended a firm hand. Colonel, he said, I'm Major Daniel Harper, Department of the Army. We've been informed of the situation. Lawson shook his hand, his grip strong. He didn't need to ask how Major Harper had arrived so quickly. The military didn't play when it came to its own. Harper turned to the airline rep. His voice was crisp. We are handling this now. A beat. Colonel Lawson and the remains of Private First Class Nathaniel Brooks will not be flying commercial. The rep blinked. Sir, we were just about to. You were just about to cover your tracks, Harper interrupted. His tone was polite, but it carried weight. He glanced back at Lawson. Sir, the Pentagon has arranged for a private military flight. Your transport is waiting. A ripple moved through the crowd. Passengers exchanged glances. The U.S. military had stepped in. Lawson exhaled, not out of relief because he hadn't needed saving, but because the mission was finally back on course. He gave a small nod. Understood, Major. Harper's gaze flicked toward the airline rep one last time. This will be addressed. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Lawson turned to the Army veteran who had been watching the entire exchange with satisfaction. Appreciate you, brother, Lawson said. The veteran tipped his head. We look out for our own. Lawson took one last look around the terminal, at the passengers who had spoken up, the ones who had refused to stay silent, the ones who had made sure this story was heard. He adjusted his uniform, squared his shoulders, and walked out. Not toward the gate, toward something bigger. But for the airline, the fallout was just beginning. They thought the situation would fade. A few apologies, a press release, maybe a carefully worded statement from their CEO. Damage control. But the public wasn't letting this go. News networks picked up the story. Veterans organizations released statements condemning the airline's actions. Politicians weighed in, demanding accountability. Then came the financial hit. By the end of the week, the airline's stock had dropped. A trending hashtag calling for a boycott gained traction. Customers flooded their social media with demands for answers. And then, the final blow. A lawsuit. A coalition of military advocacy groups filed a formal complaint against the airline. Discrimination. Failure to uphold service member protections. Under pressure, the airline's CEO made a public appearance. He called it a regrettable misunderstanding, announced that the employees involved had been placed on administrative leave. Too little, too late. Meanwhile, Colonel Eric Lawson continued his mission. He escorted Private First Class Nathaniel Brooks home. Stood by as the young soldier's family received him for the last time. Lawson didn't need the headlines, didn't need the attention. He needed respect. And that was the real fight. Because respect shouldn't be conditional. It shouldn't require a viral video. It shouldn't take public outrage. It should be the standard. The people at that airport, the Army veteran, the passengers who spoke up, the ones who refused to let this slide, they proved something important. When people stand together, injustice has nowhere to hide. So if you believe in accountability, if you believe in honoring those who serve, let your voice be heard. Because silence lets things like this happen again. And next time, it might not go viral.